The Austrian theory of inflation is actually the most interesting subject to me in Austrian economics. Now, the reason for that being is that their definition of what inflation is shared by many groups, not just their own. Anarcho-communists, some anarcho-communists, from what I've seen, actually share the same definition. In fact, it's pretty much given as the same thing in the zeitgeist Venus Project movement. They too believe the same thing. So the Austrian theory of inflation is by no means exclusionary to Austrian theory. There are many groups that support it as well. The general idea is that any increase in the money supply causes a corresponding rise in the inflation level and the price rate in commodities. Here's a generally accepted definition of inflation according to Austrians that can be found on Wikipedia. The Austrian school asserts that inflation is an increase in the money supply. Rising prices are merely consequences, and this semantic difference is important in defining inflation. Austrian economists believe there is no material difference between the concepts of monetary inflation and general price inflation. Austrian economists measure monetary inflation by calculating the growth of new units of money that are available for immediate use in exchange that have been created over time. This interpretation of inflation implies that inflation is always a distinct action taken by the central government or its central bank, which permits or allows an increase in the money supply. In addition to state-induced monetary expansion, the Austrian school also maintains that the effects of increasing the money supply are magnified by credit expansion as a result of the fractional reserve banking system employed in most economic and financial systems in the world. Usually this is thrown in with the whole battle cry against fiat currency. Well, from this we can see what the problem is. Austrians have literally just redefined what inflation is. They just define it as an increase in the money supply, while everyone else, every other economic theory, sees inflation as a general rise in the average prices of things in the economy. Now here's the really interesting part. This belief that simply raising the amount of money in the system causes inflation is actually from Milton Friedman in the quantity theory of money. He says this. Actual Austrian economists, the guys way back in the day, never said this. In fact, they largely didn't even agree with him. Now that's what's really interesting about this. People who follow Austrian economics don't even know that they're supporting an idea, a theory, that doesn't even come from Austrian economics. In fact, Mises himself was very skeptical of this idea from the quantity theory of money, according to Rothbard. He agreed with the classical quantity theory that an increase in the supply of dollars or gold ounces will lead to a fall in its value or price, i.e. a rise in the prices of other goods and services. But he enormously refined this crude approach and integrated it with general economic analysis. For one thing, he showed that this movement is scarcely proportional. An increase in the supply of money will tend to lower its value, but how much it does, or even if it does at all, depends on what happens to the marginal utility of money, and hence the demand of the public to keep its money in cash balances. Furthermore, Mises showed that the quantity of money does not increase in a lump sum. The increase is injected at one point in the economic system, and prices will only rise as the new money spreads in ripples throughout the economy. If the government prints new money and spends it, say, on paper clips, what happens is not a single increase in the price level, as non-Austrian economists would say. What happens is that first, the incomes of paperclip producers and prices of paper clips increase, and then the prices of the suppliers of the paperclip industry, and so on, so that an increase in the supply of money changes relative prices at least temporarily, and may result in a permanent change in relative incomes as well. Mises actually disagrees with this theory that simply raising the amount of money in the system causes inflation. He's specifically saying that it is other people who believe this, and that he believes other factors are involved in the general idea of inflation. Austrians essentially have two problems with inflation. The first one being the general rise in prices for goods and services, also in financial and real assets, things like real estate, stocks and bonds, things that are generally not taken into account. The other problem they have with it is that essentially increasing the money supply prevents the stable act of deflation. And deflation, in their view, allows the value of money to go up. One of the things that Austrians propound is that a deflationary currency increases in value, and that this is good for people who hold money. To deal with the first criticism, the rise in prices, most of the things like real estate and housing can actually be taken care of with financial regulation, which means most bubbles can actually be dealt with it when the government isn't completely deregulated, causing a global crash. Now, generally, house prices have stayed relatively consistent. They haven't really crashed, not since the Great Depression, and obviously in 2008, which kicked off the depression that we're in now. Generally speaking, this is not actually a problem because government regulation, when it's actually there, can prevent this problem from happening. Now for the whole issue of deflation. Now, they believe it to be a good thing. It's actually not a good thing. When deflation happens, the value of the currency rises. We'll see things like employee wages also go down because they're paid less. They're paid less dollars per hour, stuff like that, because the value of the currency went up. See, the problem is that there are debts in society, and these debts remain fixed. That makes it increasingly more difficult for people to pay back those debts. Not paying back debts causes crisis. Deflation is not a good thing. Some even highly recommend going back to the gold standard. See, well, the problem is that this makes a gold standard susceptible to external forces, like a recent discovery of new gold or existing account balances. And this makes the whole issue of the money having more value even more complicated, because you do now have external factors like the value of gold affecting the value of money. We hear constantly from Austrians that when you increase the money supply, you decrease its value and thus decrease its purchasing power. The real cause of a decrease in purchasing power is a general rise in the cost of the things that people buy. It's not exactly related every time. In fact, inflation doesn't necessarily itself cause a rise in prices. A rise in prices can actually cause an increase in the money supply. Generally speaking, people who follow Austrian economics don't realize they're not actually following an Austrian theory. They're following the quantity of money theory by Milton Friedman. And that just makes this all the more interesting, that they literally don't realize that their Austrian theory isn't actually Austrian at all. And in fact, the general Austrian economists who define what that system is don't even agree with it. Thank you for watching. Please comment and rate the video. If you liked it, hit subscribe or check out some of these other great videos. If you wish, share it on social media. And while you're at it, why don't you follow me on Twitter? And if you got time, go on over to the MRN bookstore and check out some of the latest books available.